Hello everyone, welcome to the fourth and last online lecture of this series of lectures on care economy. Today is a pleasure to have with us Marie-José Taya from the International Domestic Workers Federation. She will present a lecture on migrant domestic workers, decent work agenda and organizing. She will discuss with us the challenges, opportunities and key issues about migrant domestic workers organization based on the huge experience of the International Domestic Workers Federation. And before listening to her, let me introduce you briefly to the speaker. Marie-José Taya is the International Domestic Workers Federation Regional Coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa. She also serves as an advisor and consultant to international institutions and non-profit organizations on labor migration, care economy and domestic work. Previously, Marie-José was a technical officer on labor migration at the International Labour Organization in Geneva, as a research coordinator on migrant domestic workers at the ILO's Regional Office for Arab States, and a junior research also at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. She's a PhD candidate in political science at Kent State University, and she holds also an MA in conflict transformation as Fulbright Scholar from the EMU Center for Justice and Peaceful Building in Virginia. She has many articles on this topic. She's been writing an article, for example, Decent Work for Migrant Domestic Workers, Moving the Agenda Forward. Another one is From Domestic Work to Care Work, Governance Challenge, with Galotti. She wrote it with Galotti in Safeguarding Labor Migrants from Home to the Workplace in Asia. So we are very happy to have you with us here, Marie-José, today. It's a pleasure to close the webinars with introducing this relevant topic. And before listening to her, I would like to, as always, I would like to remind you very briefly some technical issues on how to use the platform, GoToWebinar. First, you know that there is a blue button at the console that allowed you, if you press in that blue button, allows you to view the presentation in a full screen mode that will be more comfortable for you. If the console is in the way of the presentation, you can dock it by clicking the orange arrow just above it. And if it's docked and you want to see the whole console again, just click the orange arrow again. Then, how to interact today in the Q&A sections. You know that there are two ways for interacting. The first one is typing your questions in a box, and the second one is talking to the audience with your own voice to make your questions. For the first way, know that there is a question section in the bottom area of the console. You can click in the plus signal to ensure that the questions are visible, and a box will appear and you will be able to type your questions there. You can do that during the whole conference. Then there is a second option, is that you could be able to speak aloud. If you want to do that, know that there is a little hand symbol in the left area of the console. Click in that icon to raise your hand, and we will unmute your microphone and you will be able to speak. Please note that if we have some problems with your voice, we will ask you to check your sound, and if the problems continue, we will ask you to type your questions in order to not stop the session. We also would like to inform you and apologize because we have been having some problems with the sound system, and we hope that the sound will be good enough to hear the presentation. If not, we will try to stop the presentation and try to repair. So I don't want to take more time from you, Mary Joseph. Thanks for coming, and thanks everybody. I give you the floor. Hello? Okay, now we can see the slide. Yes, it's correct.
Super. Great. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this lecture series and also for the opportunity to reach and interact with quite a diverse audience. And I say this both for myself and for the International Domestic Workers Federation. Today's lecture is about collective voice mechanisms for migrant domestic workers. The presentation is in 3 parts. I don't know if you can see the slide already. Recognizing that the course participants will come from diverse backgrounds and different levels of familiarity with the sector, I thought I could first start by defining domestic work and domestic workers, providing information about the number of migrants working in the sector, and then maybe discussing some of the main challenges that these workers face. Then after that, I thought we can talk about IDWF as the global level organizing of domestic workers, and about where, how, and why domestic workers organize at the national level and also at the migration corridor level. That's between the country of origin for domestic workers and the country of destination for domestic workers. So starting with the first question about who are migrant workers. ILO Convention 89 is short for the Domestic Workers Convention. It defines domestic work as work performed in or for a household or households. It includes cleaning, cooking, washing, ironing clothes, child and elderly care, pet minding, nursing, gardening, guarding the house, driving for the family, but also running errands for the house. A domestic worker is therefore any person, national or migrant, documented or undocumented, working full-time or part-time for single employer or multiple employers. The domestic worker can reside in the household of the employer or live independently. Now let's take a look at the size of the sector and the proportion of migrants in it. We see here that in 2015 there were 67 million men and women domestic workers in the world, of whom over 11 million were migrants. And then the majority of those, so 8.5 million of the migrant domestic workers, were women. Now, before I move to the discussion of the second slide, it's important to highlight that these numbers are underestimates. They are based on national and official statistics, but we know that domestic workers are not always counted. And this is for a variety of reasons. One of them is that they work informally, so they're not necessarily registered. Some of them are also working, they're undocumented, so they're not counted as being in the country. And there isn't always a clear boundary between who is an au pair, working for the household, but also working as a domestic worker, who is an unregistered nurse fulfilling nursing functions, but also would count as a domestic worker. And if a diplomat counts, talks about his staff or staff in the diplomatic household, we don't necessarily always know how many of those are domestic workers. So these are just a few examples. And then if we take Germany in 2009, for example, only 217,000 domestic workers were counted. And only 36,000 were registered with Social Security. But then if we take the household survey that was carried out at almost the same time, this household survey counted 1 million domestic workers. The same applies to Italy, which counts 1.5 million domestic workers through household surveys, but then only 875 are formally registered. So the statistics are always underestimates of the real number of domestic workers. And then here, if we look at the percentage of women of domestic workers, we see that almost 13% of women migrants Foreign migrant workers are domestic workers. The rest are in the services sector, industry, and agriculture. As for the geographic distribution of domestic workers in the world, we see that the Arab states host the largest number of migrant domestic workers, that's 27%. They are followed by Northern, Southern, and Western Europe with 19%, and then Southern, Eastern Europe, Eastern Asia, and the Pacific with 19%. And then if we look at flows of domestic work statistically, but we rely on case studies and we rely on research, on literature and desk review to count or to take stock of these flows, not in numbers, but in flows. So we note that domestic work continues to be a largely national phenomena, consisting of flows primarily from rural to urban areas. And here, China stands out, for example. China counts 13 million local domestic workers. India counts anywhere between 4 million and 10 million domestic workers. Now, these domestic workers travel from at least 5 provinces to work in Delhi and Mumbai. Second to internal movements are the movements between neighboring countries. Here, Latin America and Africa stand out. Argentina, for example, is known to play host to Paraguayan domestic workers and Chile to Peruvian domestic workers. Now, these movements are facilitated by, first of all, of course, regional proximity. It's easier to cross, and the fact that it's easier to cross means that it's easier to return and visit their family back home on a periodic basis. Then the free mobility regimes in sub-regions in Latin America also facilitate movement because they're not required to have visas to go to a country in the same sub-region. Also because they have these agreements that allow them to have access to social security, to social security in the country of destination, but also to the portability of these social security benefits if they choose to return to their home country. The fact that they are close to each other also means that people have always been traveling across the border, and that means that diasporic communities have been there for a while, and they usually help domestic workers find employment. They host them for a while, for a few months, and then they identify an employer. And then in a few months, the worker is ready to move on to rent her own apartment, and if she doesn't like the first employer, she can move to another employer. After that come the movements between the sub-regions. In number, I think Asia is the largest, witnesses the largest flows within its sub-regions. You often hear of Thai domestic workers in Hong Kong or Filipino domestic workers in Japan. If we look at numbers, we see that of the 67 million domestic workers around the world, 24 million, that's 35%, work in the Asia and Pacific regions. Among them, 3.3 million are migrants, meaning they have moved from one sub-region in Asia to another. Finally, and perhaps the most mediatized flows are those between regions. This is what you often hear about on the news. You hear about the flows from South Asia and East Africa to the Arab Gulf, or to Lebanon and Jordan.
Excuse me, Marie-José, that's one thing.
Yes.
There's one thing,
yes.
We are having little problems with the sound, and we are not allowed to listen to you when you pass the slides. Could you just wait when you pass the slides 2 seconds without talking so we can listen to you? Okay,
of
and
course,
just maybe talking a bit slower, just because we don't listen very loud. So if you maybe speak a bit slower, we can notice a bit more your voice. But perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, don't worry. Okay, so then we said that so women move internally between neighboring countries, between sub-regions in one region, and between different regions for multitude of reasons. Chief among those are poverty and lack of decent jobs, limited or no access to education, which leads to inequalities and access to employment opportunities, gender discrimination and gender violence. Here, for example, in interviewing domestic workers from Ethiopia, we found that the majority had left because they divorced their husbands, and divorce is considered a taboo in some of the regions. And in order to avoid that shame that's attached, or the stigma attached to divorce, they decided to travel abroad. Another reason is land dispossession, conflict, and climate change. If we look at Nepal, for example, migration for domestic work is an attractive option for the Nepalese women because they have only 10% of land ownership rights, and they hold just 0.7% of public sector jobs. So, and then if you look at education, you see that only 55% of women are educated relative to 88% of men. And these women, the 55%, are those of a higher caste. Many have reported domestic violence-free migration as a reason for traveling abroad. So you'll find that they are concentrated on low-paid jobs in Nepal and often working on farms as non-remunerated workers. This is why they decide to travel to work abroad, sometimes for very little wages, but they travel for a combination of factors, not just one. So many of these factors that you see on the slide interact together to push them to travel abroad. Now, if we look at some of the reasons that are attracting domestic workers, so some of the positive or let's say why is there an availability of jobs for domestic workers abroad? And that's so the chief reason that we often hear is care needs. And when we talk about care needs, we tend to think of Europe as an aging society that requires the services of domestic workers and households to attend for the elderly. But the world is aging overall, not just in Europe, at a slower pace perhaps. Take the case of Lebanon, my country. All the studies talk about a youth bulge in the Middle East and in Lebanon, and how this youth bulge has created an unemployment crisis. But if we look at the data, the demographics, we also find that there's a huge growing old age dependency ratio. So the data indicate that in 2015, the people aged 65 and above will make up 20% of the population. At the same time, the fertility levels have dropped from 4.6 in 1970 to 1.5 in 2012. So with people living longer, but with at least one chronic disease, the majority of the elderly will require assistance in performing their daily functions. So from taking a walk, taking a bath, preparing their meals, etc. This assistance will be mainly delivered by domestic workers. So here we can assert that the demand will grow further in the years to come. And this will require more migration and from Asia and Africa. We also find that in these countries, they have very poor social care systems. So you'll see that not all the elderly have access to proper insurance, and then if they are to go to a care institution, these are usually either privately run entirely or quasi-private, which means that even if the Ministry of Public Health contributes $10 per day, they will still need to pay $40 per day. And then the Ministry of Public Health only covers 55% of the cost of 55% of the elderly in Lebanon. And then there are other pull factors. While care demands are important in some parts of the country, you'll see that higher income countries who have lavish lifestyles also require the services of domestic workers. If we look at the Arab Gulf, for example, if we look at Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE, people there live in very large homes, sometimes requiring the services of up to 5 domestic workers at a time. So you'll see that the demand is multiplied there. In Latin America, it is common for the family to attend to the needs of the children and the elderly. But with women in the labor market, mothers and daughters have been replaced by domestic workers, as we said before, from rural areas within the same country, or from nearby countries. Now, this is facilitated, as we said, by the free mobility regimes in Latin America sub-regions, and also the recent labor reforms in the sector. So now that they have access to social security, now that they've integrated, they are covered by the labor law, more women are attracted to these sectors. And I'm assuming that most course participants are familiar with the working conditions in the sector. You will hear about women toiling long and unpredictable working hours. You'll hear that their wages are being withheld, that their personal documents are also taken by the employers, and that there are restrictions on their freedom of movement and their ability to change employers. Some of them are also food deprived. They are subject to physical, verbal, and sexual abuse, etc. But the key working conditions for domestic workers, more than in other sectors, are wages, working time, and maternity protection. Why wages? Because domestic workers the domestic work sector is perceived as an unskilled sector, something that women usually do in the household. Previously, it was done by grandmothers, then by mothers, and now it's done by the domestic worker. So it's viewed as an unproductive sector. This is why it's important for a workers' organization to work to stress and lobby for a minimum wage. It's also important to lobby for working time, so regulations, i.e. a maximum of 8 working hours per day, but also to make sure that they are not continuous, that there are proper rest hours in the middle, and that they're not during their sleep hours, for example. And this is because domestic workers, given that they are living in the household of the employer, their workplace is the household, they end up doing really unpredictable work hours. And some of them, at least in my region, have reported working 16 hours a day. And then the third is maternity protection, because it's a sector that is dominated by women, mostly poor women who need substitution for their wages as they are on maternity. So it's important to also work on that aspect. In Lebanon, there are increasingly domestic workers who are forming families here, and their insurance does not cover maternity, and so they have families, but they cannot work, and there's nothing to substitute for that. Now, also due to migration, there are specific factors that further promote the vulnerability of domestic workers. Stated briefly, one of them, the first, is the persistence of temporary migration schemes. In some countries, these are 2-year or 3-year contracts. In Lebanon and the GCC, it's like a FALA system. So these women are accepted on the basis that their contract will end, and when it expires, they will leave the country. But what these regimes do not capture is that there's a persistent demand for their services, and that these women do not have anything to go back to. So what ends up happening is that they're being pushed into the informal sector, where they are working with no proper access to services, and they cannot even declare their problems or seek the support of their diplomatic representation, because they fear repercussions on that front. The second aspect is that labor laws do not extend to domestic workers in many countries. Instead, it's usually subordinate regulations like contracts or bilateral agreements or specific labor or specific laws for domestic workers that regulate the sector. But this is not enough, because only if the labor law extends to them, you will have labor inspection, and then you can check and monitor their work conditions and their living conditions in the household. Further, the bilateral agreements between countries of origin and destination are promoting a race to the bottom in the working and living conditions of domestic workers. Because if you look at Lebanon now, Lebanon is getting ready to sign a multitude of memorandum of understanding with Ethiopia, Madagascar, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and they've agreed to different terms with these countries. So with the Philippines, it will be $400. With Bangladesh, it will be between $200 and $250. With Sri Lanka, it will be 350, and with Ethiopia, it will be between 150 and 200. And so these BLAs promote the view that some workers are actually better than others. So some nationalities are better than others. This is total discrimination, but it's happening in all countries of destination. And it's also happening with the encouragement of countries of origin because they, because they set sectorial wages in their own countries, and they negotiate those same wages with the countries of destination. Further, there is no accountability in the recruitment process. Women are cheated by village-level brokers who are unlicensed and therefore unaccountable for the promises that they make for workers about the nature of the job, about the working conditions, etc. And then deployment bans. Some countries, to protect their workers, impose deployment bans. So they prevent them from going to a certain country. But when they do that, the workers tend to go because they need the job, but they go through other routes that are less safe, and they are not taking the pre-departure orientation training, so they're not aware of the risks. And when they arrive to the country of destination, they are invisible to their diplomatic representation, and they fear returning to their home country because they will be criminalized if they return to the airport. So against that backdrop and others, the IDWS was established as a network of domestic workers organizations, first in 2009 to support the adoption of an international standard on domestic workers. Then in 2013, IDWS became a formal federation of domestic workers organizations. That is a global union of domestic workers. Today, IDWS counts 62 affiliates in 50 countries. That's 500,000 individual domestic worker members. Most of these affiliates are either trade unions, the rest are membership-based associations and worker cooperatives. So really, IDWS is perhaps the only trade union that is led entirely by women.
Excuse me, Mary Joseph, we cannot hear you in the past slide.
Yes?
We couldn't hear the past slide.
Oh, don't worry, because I had said it earlier, so there was a delay in sending it. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this is a snippet about IDWF's objectives and mission, so sort of its mission statement. I invite you to read the IDWF Constitution on our website. I've included a link at the bottom of the slide, but if you go to idwfed.org and then go to About Us, you'll find the Constitution there. It outlines our goals and the methods, etc. In brief, IDWF aims to build strong domestic workers organizations, to unite domestic workers organizations nationally, regionally, and globally, and to promote the leadership of women within these organizations. So IDWF has also, if you want, a unique approach to, well, a unique identity and approach to organizing. Because it's affiliated to two organizations, this is kind of a giveaway of its hybrid identity. It's affiliated first to the IUF, and that's the International Union of Food, Agricultural, Hotel, Restaurant, Catering, Tobacco, and Allied Workers Associations. And then it's affiliated to WIGO, which is a Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. WIGO, so IUF is a traditional global trade union, whereas WeGo is a global research policy network that seeks to improve the situation of the working poor, especially women, in the informal economy, and that's in sectors that are not easily or not organized by classic trade unions, like, for example, street vendors, waste pickers, and domestic workers. This is also why if some of you are familiar with our work, you will find that IDWF does not fit into the trade union organizing culture or in the NGO or association culture. We're sort of in the middle. And this is a bit challenging when working with other partners in the field, who will often tell you, you need to choose who you work with. Either you work with NGOs or with trade unions. But in IDWF, we don't see the dichotomy. We don't see the difference. We think it's a matter of timing and sequencing. We help women workers organization in non-traditional sectors that are not organized by unions to progressively, and when the timing is right, morph into traditional trade unions. So, and this preceded the IDWF, but it took 22 years for the Jamaica's Household Workers Association, so an association, to register as a formal union. And it took 25 years for the National Domestic Workers Movement in India to organize domestic workers into state-level unions. So these things take a lot of time to happen, and I think IDWF is very cognizant of the slow transformation, and it takes a bit of an unorthodox approach for trade union, but this is why I believe it will be successful in achieving its stated objectives. Now, if we look at our ongoing global campaign, so if we look at organizing globally, there are 3 ongoing global campaigns by the IDWF. With the ITUC, the IDWF has launched the 12 by 12 campaign in 2011. This campaign aimed for the ratification of the Domestic Workers Convention, and it aimed to push for 12 countries to ratify by the end of 2012. And then a second phase of the 20 by 20 campaign was launched in 2014, and it was called 12 plus 12, so aiming at 12 plus 12 ratifications, and the organization of 100,000 more domestic workers by 2018. Now, the second ongoing campaign is the My Fair Home campaign. Now, this campaign was launched in 2015 with the ILO. It targets employers, either individually or organizations of employers, for example, banks who, with staff who employ domestic workers. And then they will do this as part of their corporate social responsibility reports. It also targets government officials. Our colleagues in Africa have worked with the government officials who are employers of domestic workers. And here in Lebanon and in other countries, we've done it with trade unionists who are also employers of domestic workers. When organizations join the campaign, their members pledge to pay fair wages to domestic workers, at least the minimum wage. They pledge to ensure fair working hours and rest periods, to negotiate the terms of employment with a domestic worker, and to set those terms in writing. Then they also pledge to ensure access to decent health care and a home free from abuse, from harassment and violence, and to provide a safe, secure, and private bedroom for the worker. It also encourages them it also actually stresses that they should allow the worker to spend her free time wherever and however she chooses. Now, the third and final campaign has just started. It's with the ITUC again, and the ITUC is the International Trade Union Confederation. It's getting ready to launch the Stop Gender-Based Violence campaign in support of an ILO Convention and recommendation on violence and harassment against women and men in the world of work. So it takes the gender aspect rather than the sectorial aspect. So what's expected is to ask our affiliates to support this process, to lobby the governments and employers to support the adoption of this standard, and to build a very global movement alliance. Now, having discussed the profile of migrant domestic workers and introduce the IDWF as a global form of organizing. I will move to discuss what is meant by domestic workers organizing at the national level or at the corridor level. Now, organizing is a loaded concept. It's often understood to mean structure. So people, when you talk about organizing, they say, well, it's a federation of domestic workers union, it's a domestic workers union, it's an association, etc. But it's really the form with the issues that it takes on, along with the platforms that are used to push for certain issues. So the forums, the issues, and the platforms are all shaped by a variety of factors. These factors include time and context, for example. Context, or the legal framework, and the practical barriers are important in determining the forms of organizing. Domestic workers are more likely to join or form trade unions where the governments extend labor protection to them, so they are covered by the labor law, and where they enjoy the right to freedom of association, also where an employer's organization or a collective bargaining partner has been identified. They know who they can negotiate with. Where it is illegal to form domestic workers unions, but legal to organize, domestic workers have established cooperatives and workers' centers. Now, where freedom of association is lacking, domestic workers have joined faith-based institutions or formed cultural hubs. Where the political space for self-organizing is limited, migrants usually rely on local unions and organizations to take up their concerns. But it's not unlikely for the association model of organizing to mature into the traditional model of organizing, such as the trade union model. Now, the second variable that affects what form these domestic workers decide to adopt to have a collective voice is also intersectionality. Domestic workers are discriminated on account of various things. One, their gender, the fact that they're women. Two, their nationality, their social status, their race, their caste, their age, and their occupation. So they can choose to organize around one of these identities, or two, or all of these identities combined, depending on what in their view is the most important or salient. But sometimes, in the case of migration, it's easier to organize around nationality. It's the default by default, because they go to the same places, to the same events, and this is the automatic form of organizing amongst, or one of the early forms of organizing amongst domestic workers by nationality. And then another variable is the broader narrative. So the most successful domestic workers campaigns have been those that attach themselves to a broader national narrative to gain a broader endorsement by the people, by the citizens of their country for their struggle. Here we look, for example, at the South African Domestic Workers Union. And Tsatsawu emerged from the fight against apartheid. So the domestic workers formed their union at the same time as they were fighting the apartheid. And so they're part of this collective psyche, and they're accepted, and they receive the support of the people. In the Philippines, the Labor Education and Research Network was also a staunch advocate for domestic workers' rights. It was established, so its members, not itself because it wasn't there first, but its members were actually some of the people who were involved in the People Power Revolution, which ousted Marcos. And this is who was able to organize domestic workers, who united recently. And you'll see that now, for example, in the States, domestic workers are attaching themselves to the broader narrative against police brutality with the African American community. Having said that, let's take each of these cogwheels separately and discuss them. So if we start with the first cogwheel about the forms of organizing, we see that there are, as we said earlier, there's the classical trade union structure, the association model, and then mixed models. And these are models that bring together associations and trade unions. So domestic workers, migrants specifically, when they look to organize in the context of a union, they face numerous challenges. They are sometimes excluded from the right to freedom of association, so they cannot form or join trade unions because they're excluded from the labor law. They are also excluded from the right to hold elected positions within the unions. That's if they are accepted to join a union. Then they are excluded from the rights. They cannot hold they cannot hold elected positions. Now, if they're in an irregular status, it's complicated because they are afraid of losing their jobs or of being deported. From an operational perspective, so beyond the legal aspect, from an operational perspective, the fact that domestic workers are isolated in individual households, this doesn't fit into the traditional model of workplace organizing. So it's not like in the case of the construction sector where an organizer can go to the construction site and organize workers there. It's hard to bring these workers together. The fact that they're women is also hard because it stands in contradiction with the overwhelming male composition of unions. There's also the language barriers. Some countries host as many as 12 or 14 nationalities of domestic workers. So it's really hard to bring them together without translators, and bringing translators is very costly and time-consuming to translate into these different languages, especially when domestic workers are new to a country. Eventually, they don't learn the language, and then all of them can at least speak in the language of the host society. There's also a significant challenge, and that's the fact that the leaders of the domestic workers communities wear multiple hats. There are leaders in their migrant communities at first, and we said that domestic workers tend to first congregate according to nationality, either in church groups or around embassy events, etc. And so they develop leadership. The women that emerge from these diasporic structures then become trade union leaders and invite the members of their diasporic community into the trade union. And because of that, they wear the two hats. They wear the hat of leadership, the community leadership of their diasporic association, and the trade union leadership hat. And trade unions, for those who know them, they are very hierarchical, and they don't necessarily accept that a worker makes public speeches as for her migrant community without checking with the trade union. And so this tends to create some tension. Low salaries of domestic workers, sometimes they earn as little as $120 a month, mean that domestic workers are unable to pay the membership dues, and they're also unlikely to pay for transportation to attend union activities. Where the leave day is respected, domestic workers are more likely to rest or to go to the mall or to enjoy their day rather than to spend their free time with the union. But the trade unions are very creative, and they've come up with some strategies to organize non-traditional domestic workers. So one, they can sign a memorandum of understanding with a trade union in the country of origin for the domestic worker, and that way the domestic worker can be a member, before leaving, she can become a member of the trade union in her country of origin, and then de facto she will become a member in the trade union in the country of destination. Close to this is the association that was recently formed of Tanzanian domestic workers in Oman, here in the Arab Gulf, and these women are liaising with their union, the Shodawi union in Tanzania. When they cannot set up domestic workers union, they were able to set up committees of domestic workers. In Lebanon, for example, before the domestic workers union was set up, It was a domestic workers committee. So it allowed for some form of representation among domestic workers. And in order to access, to deal with the operational aspect of organizing workers, to overcome their isolation, unions have adopted a community-based model versus the traditional workplace model of organizing. So they will identify a neighborhood organizer who will liaise or communicate with live-in domestic workers by chatting with them across the balconies and arranging to meet them when they take the rubbish out, the trash out, etc. Now for language barriers and cultural differences, when you have domestic workers coming from different countries, we can look at the example of FADU, which is the Federation of Asian Domestic Workers Unions in Hong Kong. They set up separate unions for each of these nationalities, and then they all affiliated with the Federation of Asian Domestic Workers Union. So they are represented at the national level, but also at the federation level. And then to attract workers who are unable to pay for membership dues and are unable to spend money on transportation to the trade union, unions have adopted a service-oriented approach. So they are offering them either free legal services or free training courses or free healthcare services in order to attract them to become new members. And then the small fee will become tolerable. The second model is the association model of representation, and this is when domestic workers organize around an identity, one of the identities that we discussed earlier, either them being women or being from a specific country or being a feminist NGO, for example. Or around the migration identity overall. So one of the examples is the United Kingdom-based Kalayan. It's a real example of the association model of organizing. It was established in 1987, and it campaigned for the formal recognition of migrant domestic workers in the United Kingdom. So it worked specifically on migration-related issues, not on labor laws and their inclusion in the labor law or their access to social security. It was only working on their migration status and migration-related concerns. So it wasn't sectorial in its view. It wasn't striving to improve the working conditions of workers, but rather the migration status. Now the last model is the collaboration model, and this is when an association of workers, like a self-help group of domestic workers, affiliates with a national or international union federation. One of the examples, although now I think it's defunct for a year, is Mari. It's a feminist NGO of Nepalese women domestic workers in Lebanon, whose members were affiliated with the General Federation of Nepalese Trade Unions. So they became immediately members of the trade union because they were Nepalese and affiliated with this NGO, with the self-help group that they created. Again, this organization is now defunct, but it was a good practice for a while. Now, if we look at the issues that domestic workers take on, these issues can range from macro level issues. So these are concerns that are structural. They either look at globalization and historical inequalities and the impact of export-led economies of their countries. And here, the Philippines is quite renowned for its organizations. Its domestic workers organizations are quite renowned for taking on this approach. One of the examples is Damayan in the U.S. It's an organization of Filipina domestic workers whose approach is anti-globalization, anti-empire. It takes on historical perspective of trafficking and of the abuses that domestic workers face today. It roots them in the history of the Philippines. And then if you look at there are also domestic workers who take on meso-level issues, and these are the national and state-level regulations or laws. So to improve the recruitment regulations, to include domestic workers under the labor law, to ensure that they are included or registered with Social Security, etc. And then there are micro-level issues, so such as launching awareness-raising campaigns and information campaigns for employers, taking on court cases, and then seeking reparations for domestic workers. And these are, the micro level is when they're, so it's basically affecting the individual domestic worker or trying to change the attitudes and behaviors of the public. So one is structural, one is country level policies or policy level, and the third one is individual level or attitude and behavioral change. Now, where do domestic workers raise these issues? They tend to raise them either at the local level. For example, in the Philippines, they are known to discuss these issues with the municipality, and the IDWS is supporting these dialogue sessions at the municipal level. Some are raised at the national level through, in Lebanon, there's a National Steering Committee on Women, Migrant, Domestic Workers. It's a tripartite entity that involves the Ministry of Labor, the Syndicate of Recruitment Agencies, and employers, NGOs, and some of the NGOs that provide services to domestic workers. Unfortunately, domestic workers are not represented in this National Steering Committee, but efforts are being made now by the NGOs and the Domestic Workers Union to push for their representation in that platform. Then another level, another platform for raising issues is the binational platform, when negotiations for MOUs are being are underway. To date, domestic workers unions have been excluded from these negotiations, but recently one of the IDWS affiliates in Africa, I think it was Kenya or Uganda, have actually required an audience with the Ministry of Labor, and they have provided comments on the draft MOU, and they are pushing and lobbying for changes in the draft of the MOU that is being discussed with some countries in the Arab Gulf. Then domestic workers can take up their issues at the regional level by speaking in processes or that are usually only for governments, or in tripartite regional processes like the regional and economic commissions, and raising their issues in these platforms. From my region, for example, the Domestic Workers Union representatives have participated in some of these processes in Asia. They've participated in SARTUC meetings, and they've participated with the meetings that have been organized by the ILO and that have involved member states and employers groups. The fifth level is the regional level. And in my region again, this would involve the Abu Dhabi Dialogue, which is a platform for member states who are countries of destination for domestic workers. Unfortunately, domestic workers have not had any engagement with these platforms, but the hope is that someday they will be able to speak to these member states. And then finally, the global level, and I don't know if you're familiar with the Global Forum on Migration and Development, and which is taking place right now in Berlin. This is an event that takes place every year and is chaired by one of the governments, and civil society tends to be there for the first 3 days and then shares a common space with the governments on the 4th day, and they tend to make their vote to voice concerns during those shared days. In brief, the strategies that the unions use to reach out to domestic workers are either services. They also launch research. They launch research studies and launch corresponding campaigns to lobby for wage change or for better occupational safety and health standards. They also do outreach and information sessions, and they forge partnerships with NGOs, with government agencies, with other labor NGOs, for example, with people with disabilities who require the services of domestic workers. Now, in looking at some of the outcomes of these organizing endeavors, I did a cursory review of a new publication that was released only last week on the occasion of the anniversary of the convention, the 6th anniversary of Convention 189, and that's Domestic Workers Speak. And I did a cursory review of years of domestic worker organizing. And internationally, we can categorize these wins from the global to the very local, from those that have been codified in law to the more abstract little wins. If you look at the international level, starting in 2009, Domestic Workers Union have been pushing for the adoption of the standards on domestic work. They've even informed the text of these standards by identifying what their concerns were. Then they, at the national level, domestic workers organizations pushed for the ratification of the convention. Then they also succeeded in negotiating collective bargaining agreements that have provided minimum wage for domestic workers. And here we cite the experience of France, we cite the experience of Italy, we cite the experience of Uruguay, we cite the experience of Argentina, etc. And then domestic workers have also succeeded in pushing for national legislation or regulations or codes of practice. And Italy has pushed for law on domestic work early on, decades ago. Justice for Domestic Workers has pushed for an amendment to the Modern Slavery Act in order to grant domestic workers the ability to change employers. And Hong Kong has recently pushed for the introduction of a new code of practice to regulate employment agencies. And then at the state and local level, the National Domestic Workers Alliance in the US has been pushing for bills of rights at the state level. And it has succeeded in passing seven legislations, the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights in seven states. Domestic workers organizations also succeed in taking up legal action, and they take up legal action and then succeed in ensuring reparations for workers for unpaid wages. They force the government to pay off to reimburse the worker for unpaid wages when the employer is a diplomat with immunity. And they ask their governments to compensate domestic workers retroactively for unearned bonuses. Domestic workers have also succeeded in joining platforms for discussing labor laws, wages, social protection. They have also succeeded in changing their terminology and therefore also affecting cultural change around the sector. They've made sure that you do not call her a servant anymore, rather a collaboratrice familiare or an assistant, family assistant or a carer. In North Korea, the Domestic Workers Cooperative, which is an IDWS affiliate, has campaigned it launched a campaign called Call Us House Managers. They do not want to be called maids or help, or they want to be called house managers. Before I close, I decided to pick some photos from IDWF affiliates across the world and some of the things that they have done over the course of the past 6 months. And here we see a photo from the IDWF affiliate, the Syndicat National des Employés de Maison, who pushed for the ratification of Convention 189 in Guinea just this year. In Hong Kong, the practices of recruitment agencies. And the government of Hong Kong has promised that they will enforce legislation to penalize recruiters that are not abiding by the code of practice. And the Journal that have recently succeeded in pushing for approving the regularization of 590 undocumented migrant workers. stress that organizing domestic work cover better working conditions for migrant domestic workers and to realize the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. See, migration for domestic work is important for the development of societies and of women migrant workers. If the necessary protections are in place, if labor laws are extended to them, if they earn minimum wage and wage increases based on skill and competence level, that means if the sector is professionalized, if they have access, if they have the right to freedom of association, then migrant domestic workers will make significant financial, political, and knowledge transfers to their home countries. Financial, like money transfers, most of the workers that I've interviewed in my region have transferred up to 80% of their monthly wages to their home countries. Now these wages have gone to educate their children, to build homes, to buy land, to support the daily purchases of their family. Two, they make political contributions. If they build representative workers' organizations in Lebanon or in Jordan, and when they go to their home country, they are effective leaders who can also lead change in their communities because they have the skills to run organizations now. And then they also make knowledge transfers. They're learning new languages and they're learning new skills. So domestic work has a societal value. It's not just the monetary gain or the political gain or the knowledge gain. It's also the fact that they're preparing employers' children for the future. They're maintaining the capabilities of the elderly and the disabled. And they're also allowing women to go and integrate the labor market. And by that, they are directly contributing to the achievement of many goals of the new agenda, like Goal 1 on ending poverty, or 5 on achieving gender equality, or 8 on promoting decent work and economic growth, or 10 on reducing inequalities. So organizing is a very important strategy in that regard. It's important that domestic workers' organizations are able to perform, are able to organize, are able to lobby the governments, their governments and the governments of their host societies to change the laws, to improve their working conditions, and to be in a better position to support the development of their societies and the societies of the countries of destination, and most importantly, to support themselves, to become more empowered, to have better prospects, not just return to their home countries and not have the right skills to move up the career ladder. And on this note, I will end. Thank you for listening. I hope it wasn't too patchy, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very, very much, Marie-José. And thanks, yeah, despite some technical issues, I think it worked well enough to hear you. So, and it was a really interesting and well systematized presentation, I would say. It's quite common to discuss working and living conditions of domestic workers, but it's not that common to discuss on how to organize to fight for domestic workers' rights and specifically for migrant domestic workers' rights. So now we can have the Q&A section. We've got about 25 minutes. As you already know, all participants, you can either type your questions. We already have one question. I will now share it with you. Or you can raise your hand to speak aloud. I'm going to unraise all hands and because I think some people was confused and raised their hands during the presentation. So now you can, if you want to speak aloud, please raise your hand and we will unmute your microphones. So the first question, give me one moment, is by Garam. So Garam, she asks, she says, thanks for the presentation. As you indicated in your presentation, the demand for domestic workers, especially in the Middle East, is increasing. In your opinion, why is there very little regulation applicable to these type of workers? Why are they left out of the protection of social security and labor laws in many countries, particularly in the MENA region? Wouldn't it be more beneficial to governments if these workers are paying taxes and protected by social security regulations? Marie-José, what do you think?
Okay, well, thank you for this question. Indeed, it's like the biggest dilemma of the century in this region. The main problem is that domestic workers are perceived as unskilled, right? And they're perceived so as unskilled workers who are performing a job that is not special, that doesn't require any education, etc., and that they are easily replaceable. This is not the case, right? But this is unfortunately the perspective of most governments in this region and of most people in this region. The truth is that domestic workers are increasingly, domestic work is increasingly becoming a skilled profession. They're not only attending to classical household cleaning functions, but in addition to that, they are also attending to the care needs of these people. And we know that care is quite a complicated task. I was just interviewing a domestic worker this weekend, and she told me about how she is putting a feeding tube in the stomach of a cancer patient, how she is taking the blood pressure of the patient on a daily basis, how she is giving she's giving injections to the patient, and how she is liaising with the doctor to make sure that everything is in order. And then she lamented. She said occasionally they will bring in a nurse and they will pay her $40 for 3 hours, whereas I'm there operating on full-time basis and I only make $280 a month. And I told her, did you ever raise this issue with your employer? And she said yes. And my employer told me that if I wasn't happy, then I should just leave because many other workers would love to have my job and they would agree to even a lower wage. And unfortunately, this is true. Many workers would step in for this job at a lower wage, and these are women who have just arrived into the country because there's this never-ending flow of women who are coming. And when they first arrive, they tend to earn lower wages than when they have been here for 20 years. So one, there's always this supply. Unfortunately, I'm using this economic term when they are human beings, and I really apologize for that. There is a readily available supply of workers who are willing to take any wage. And two, there's still an underappreciation by employers in Lebanon and the government that these women are unique, that the fact that they have been here for 20 years, they have learned the language, they have learned skills, and they've become indispensable. They are not replaceable by a newly arrived, that these skills should be recognized. So it's important, and this is what IDWS is doing in Lebanon, is discussing with the government and with different stakeholders in the country the possibility of setting up a vocational training program for domestic workers. That way their skills become recognized, and that way the union can take up and bargain collectively for wage increases based on skill and competency level, not nationality. The second issue related to your question is the fact that to date, the civil society in this region has been struggling with the sector, trying to understand what it is, how it's organized, how recruitment is organized, is trying to understand the regulations, etc. But they're not at the level yet where they can present alternatives to the existing system. So when the governments tell them, okay, you are against the sponsorship system, what are your alternatives? They are not able to respond to that. So again, the IDWS, with some of the NGOs here in Lebanon, are working together to come up with the possible alternatives to the sponsorship system. That way this is not used as an excuse anymore to prevent a normal, to prevent their inclusion under the labor law and a proper governance of the sector. I hope this answered it.
Thanks very much, Marie-José. There's a second question by the same participant, by Garam. She said, thank you. And one more question. Are there studies by the IDWF on the flow of remittances by domestic workers in Lebanon? Do women send larger amounts back to their homes than men? Also, who is the recipient, and is there a difference in the type of investment between a male recipient versus a female recipient? Are there good practices of countries recipient of remittance that maintain data statistics on this? If you want, of course, Marie-José, answer this. If not, because Garam is a participant of the course, we can share with her some research on that. Thanks.
Yeah, that's true. I will just answer speedily whatever I can here on the spot. There are no studies by the IDWF on the flow of remittances by domestic workers in Lebanon, so there are no studies at this stage. But then I encourage you to look at UN Women. They've done many studies on flows of remittances from countries of destination to countries of origin, and you can look there. I can tell you from my interviews here in Lebanon and Jordan, they are remitting at least 80% of their wages. That's because, and that's for live-in domestic workers, because they don't have to pay the cost of rent and other expenses, so they can remit the majority of their wage. And this is also the case when domestic workers have younger children that they're trying to raise, but when their children are grown up, and they've moved on to jobs, then they don't have to send the majority of their salaries to their home country anymore. Also, who is the recipient, and is there a difference in the type of investment between a male recipient versus a female recipient? The recipient is usually the sister or the mother of the domestic worker, and they rely on them to raise their children. Also, they send this money for their mother and their father's expenses at home, so for healthcare, etc. Difference between male recipient and female recipient, I honestly cannot tell you that, but previous studies in other parts of the world have indicated that migrants tend to remit a larger portion of their money when they do not intend on staying in the country of destination, because then they're planning to return to that country. So they will try to invest in land, in homes, in businesses, etc. So I think this would apply for both men and women. And in case men send more, it's because they earn more. If you look at Bangladesh, women, the sectorial minimum wage for women here is $350. For men, it's $450. Same for Sri Lanka, it's $100 or $150 more. So they have the potential to send or remit a larger amount. Are there good practices of countries recipient of remittance? Yes, and Mexico. They produce every year a statistical compendium on remittance data. So you can look there. Yeah, and then you can also look at the World Bank. They have a huge database that looks into remittance flows, but it's not specific to domestic work. But then you can estimate, you know, that some countries send more domestic workers than others, and you can focus on those. Yeah.
Thanks very much for such a complete answer. And we've got another question by Valentina Utari. She asks, have migrant workers' organizations been engaged with the workers' employers? If yes, in what way? Have you also made collaboration with schools in the essence of educating the new generation about the importance of this low-paid care work for the quality of their life? Thanks in advance, and thank you for your presentation.
Thank you. Have migrant workers organizations been engaged with the workers' employers? Domestic workers organizations have. If you look at Europe, where domestic workers have engaged in collective bargaining negotiations with employers associations, so this is at the organizational level, but then individually, yes. Here in Lebanon, the Alliance of Migrant Domestic Workers has often made presentations in universities and in schools. So on a monthly basis, its leaders will go and speak to different universities and to university students and to school children to tell them about the challenges that are faced by domestic workers and to also encourage them to change the behavior of their parents. Now children are exposed to human rights frameworks, they watch TV, they are more sensitized to these issues than their parents. So it's always, the message is, you can reach out to your grandmother, you can reach out to your father and try to convince them of your views. Try to tell them about the challenges that we're facing. Some have even encouraged domestic employers to, school children to write projects about the domestic workers in their homes. What else? Okay, thank you. So third, I am interested in
Thank you, Marie-José. There's another question by Edna Kulk. Thank you for the presentation. I am interested in the analysis of the MOUs between countries. In Uganda, we have had a number of MOUs, but do not quite state the pay. Is it possible to share with us some of the tools or issues to look out for when negotiating or reviewing some of the MOUs, especially for CCOs and the domestic workers themselves? Usually this is left to the lawyers.
Sure. Yes, MOUs are really big, especially for Uganda. And recently, Uganda, I think in 2005, they signed an MOU with the government of with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The plan was to send 5 million domestic workers, or 1 million domestic worker, men and women, over the course of 5 years to Saudi Arabia. And then the MOU discussed access to the labor market, but did not discuss protection issues. So 5 months later, the MOU was brought to a halt. It was blocked for a few years, but now I understand this MOU is in effect again, and it's been revised. I haven't seen the text. There are tools to analyze these MOUs. There are 2 studies. There's one, it's been written by Lin Lim. It's called Gender-Sensitive Bilateral Labor Agreements. So how to make bilateral agreements more attuned to the needs of women migrants, especially domestic workers. Another study was written by Piaciri Wikramasekara, and it's called MOUs and so a Memorandum of Understanding and Bilateral Labor Agreements on for labor migration. And there I think he analyzed over 300 MOUs and BLAs, and he provides a checklist of some of the things that need to be considered when reviewing these MOUs. So Piaciri Wikramasekara and Lin Lim on gender-sensitive labor migration and MOUs, BLAs and MOUs.
Thanks a lot, Marie-José. There's another question by Perla Buenrostro. She says, hello, thanks for the webinar. How are you linking your work to initiatives as He4She or the work that the UN is conducting with corporations? From my point of view, this is key to have an integral approach to care economy and their implications for different groups. What do you think?
I have to admit I'm not familiar with the He4She initiative, so I will not state anything else. But then I'm curious. I will go Google it and find out.
Okay, so next question by Senia Dia. She asks, what points of entrance have shown to be effective to address domestic workers at local and regional level?
What points of, like entry points for local level, meaning national or municipal level? Okay, let's see. So for local level, if we take the municipal level in the Philippines, the IDWF project supported United, which is the domestic workers union there, to have frequent discussions with employers at the municipality level. So they've held multiple fora where domestic workers have stepped in and discussed some of the challenges that they are facing, and then they try to address those at the municipality level. At the national level, points of entrance for, let's say, for organizing, I would say, yeah, are we talking about organizing here, or are we talking about the legislative so issues, or were, okay, so let's say for organizing, entry points have been going to existing platforms of platforms where domestic workers, where migrants meet, i.e. churches, next to transportation hubs like trains, bus stops, also to areas where you will find lots of ethnic grocery stores that domestic workers go to find products from their home countries, and then reaching out to them there. At the regional level, and here I'm assuming we're talking about policy issues, and the entry points will be using the regional processes, so existing regional processes, and bringing the voice of domestic workers to these processes. Addressing issues, I would say, that are common to a lot of countries of origin, rather than picking and choosing the issues that are particular to one country of origin. This way you can bring all the countries of origin together on a common issue. One of them in Asia is the deployment bans. Most countries in Asia are imposing deployment bans for their workers who are coming to the Middle East, thinking that this is how they're protecting them. Unfortunately, this is causing the opposite effect. And so the IDWF participated in the Colombo process, which is a process for member states in countries of origin in Asia, and we spoke about these issues openly in the meeting, and then in the technical working group, and we tried to raise the attention to the challenges from our perspective here at Destination, And while there was resistance at first, but then we've had some questions informally. And I think this has also caused one of the international organizations to look into the possibility of launching a study about alternatives to deployment bans that would be shared with the governments of this platform. So it came out as one of the recommendations from the process. I hope this answered it. I'm sorry.
Thanks a lot. We still have 5 more minutes if you want to raise any other issue. In the meanwhile, I would take the opportunity to ask you, Marie-José, in some countries, for example, in some European countries, I would say that migrant domestic workers are more active in organizing than autochthonous. National domestic workers have historically been. I wanted to ask you whether you have seen this in any other context, or maybe this is a wrong perception, and if you have seen it, why do you think that happens?
I'm sorry, you said because it broke for a while, you said the European countries are more active in organizing.
Migrant domestic workers are more active in organizing themselves than autochthonous national domestic workers have historically.
Well, I would say it's because of the fact that they are, usually if you're in your country if you're in your own country, then you would go to, you're not going to associate with other domestic workers from the sector because you're in your own country. So in your free time, you're going to see your parents, you're going to see your friends. But if you're a migrant, your friends are people from your own community who are probably also doing domestic work. So it's easier to form these relationships. I would assume this is the reason why. The main problem is that you cannot bring domestic work. The biggest challenge is to organize or develop organizations of national and migrant domestic workers. One, because national domestic workers are usually, have a better way of acquiring better wages, negotiating wages, and they know the system, they speak the language, etc. And so migrant domestic workers are an added advantage. In these organizations, it's always hard to achieve balance.
Okay, thanks a lot. We've got a participant, Mojisola, who wants to speak to you. So we will unmute your microphone, Moji, now, and we'll try to hear you. And maybe this would be the last one. Let's see how long it takes. Moji, can you speak to us, please? We cannot hear you. I'm afraid we have unmuted your microphone, but we don't hear anything. Oh, she said something. Ah, okay. She says, sorry, my question has been answered. So, great. Good. So, if there is no other question waiting from the participants, I think Alba had one question. Alba?
Okay. Yes. Okay. Thanks a lot, Marie-José, because it was very interesting, your presentation. I was really interested in the forms of representation, the different ways of representation that you presented. I don't know if you could develop a little bit more on these mixed models, specifically in these models about collaboration between domestic workers, cooperatives, and trade unions. I don't know, what do you think about these cooperatives as a way of organization, the challenges that they achieve? In which regions do they have more representation? Could you explain a bit more about this?
Well, there are 3 cooperatives that are always cited as example of good practices for organizing domestic workers. And this is the Jamaican Household Workers Association. The second is the Self-Employed Women's Association, so SEWA and its cooperatives. And the third is the South Korea House Managers Cooperative. Now, they're each different. The Jamaican Household Workers Association was established as a cooperative in 1991. It basically lobbied and it worked with employers, governments, and trade unions to make sure that that workers benefit from fair wages and ethical employment practices. It then recently became a trade union, so now it's shifted its focus from the economic interest of its members and now it's more advocating rights issues for the sector broadly. The other one is SEWA's cooperatives, and all the service housing, small and medium, the small grants that they provide to the domestic workers who are members of SEWA. And the third is the House Managers Cooperative in Korea, which has been really successful in terms of training, so skilling, and then placing workers, so job matching and skilling. So you can see that each one of them is set differently. One is for matching and skilling, one is for supporting the women workers organization by making sure that they have the adequate services, and the third one was doing the work of a union. So Jamaica was doing the work of the union until it shifted completely to a trade union structure. But yeah, these are the three main examples that I can think of.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And it's exactly 1:30 wherever you are, the time.
It's
oh, there's a, yeah. Edna says, thank you for the response. Please share with us the links to the tools. Maybe you can share with us some tools and we can share. Great, great.
Of course.
Okay, so I think it's a great way to finalize the Care Economy online lecture series. This is the fourth and last one, as you know. Thank you very, very much, Marie-José, for sharing this time with us and for sharing all your knowledge and your experience. And thanks very much also to all participants. We hope you have enjoyed this lecture. And yeah, thanks very much, and good luck with all the very interesting and relevant work of IDWF, and hope that we will see an improvement in living and working conditions of domestic workers, along with an overall change in the care economy and in the care culture. So Marie-José, thanks a lot.
Thank
Do you want to say
Thank you for the
anything as
opportunity. No, I just say that it was really interesting. First of all, I'm proud to be part of your online lecture series. I often heard about them, but I'm really privileged to be part of it. And I thank you on behalf of IDWF for giving us the opportunity yet again this year to speak to your course participants. And so thank you for the whole process and for all the participants in the course for the wonderful questions. And I will send you the documents, the links to the documents, and look forward to hearing from you if you have questions. I've put my email address in the PowerPoint, so please do not hesitate to write with questions as well. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks very much for this availability as well, Marie-José. Thanks to everyone, and have a good day. And see you, for those who are participants of the course, see you in the course, in the platform. And for those who are not, thanks very much for sharing this time with us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.